What is up, nerds? I have Professor Michael Franz from the amazing Bowdoin College, wonderful small school in Maine, who is an expert in government and specifically looks a lot into campaign advertising, election reform, campaign fundraising, that kind of stuff. So we're going to get into it. But before we do that, Andrew's going to warm us up.
There's no place to hide now that he's arrived. I'm saying he ain't playing now with this campaign. Bang, dang, it's in. Drew, come roll with the Yang Gang. Drew Yang Gang, that's who I hooked up with. Drew Yang Gang, that's who I hooked up with. Drew Yang Gang, that's who I hooked up. Yo, there's no place to hide now that he's arrived. I'm saying he ain't playing now with this campaign. Bang, dang, it's in. Drew, come roll with the Yang Gang.
Hello, nerds.
Hello, nerds.
I saw the Vulcan sign there. I love it. How you doing, Michael?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm good. Well, I'm very excited to have you on the show because I know a lot of your research involves government and American politics, and that's what a lot of folks that are watching this live stream or will be watching it on replay are super interested in. Maybe we could start with a little bit of introduction to yourself, your background, and what you do, and then we'll dig into some more specifics.
Yeah, that's great. I am a professor of government and legal studies at Bowdoin College in beautiful Brunswick, Maine. And I'm also the co-director of the Wesleyan Media Project, which tracks and codes and analyzes political advertising in American elections. I've been at Bowdoin for about 16 years. Before that, I did my graduate work at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And I'm originally from Massachusetts, Haverhill, Massachusetts, lifelong Red Sox fan and politics fan. And probably became interested in politics mostly in the 1988 presidential election when I wanted Michael Dukakis to win because we had never had a Michael as president of the United States. So, and it all started from there.
I remember that campaign. That was the one with the tank.
The tank
helmet.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. So many memorable moments in that campaign. I was only 12, but I was deeply interested in that election and watched the conventions and the debates and it hooked me.
Yeah. And so what was your dissertation about?
My dissertation was about interest groups, outside groups. So today we might call them super PACs, but back in the early 2000s, we were talking about a whole range of different types of outside groups and their involvement in elections, American elections. And I was mostly interested in the debate that was ongoing at the time around the McCain-Feingold campaign finance reform legislation and big discussions that were happening at the time about parties and their use of what was called soft money and issue advocacy. And there was a big Supreme Court case about McCain-Feingold in 2003. And I was writing my dissertation at that time. So I wrote about what really inspired this sort of aggressive and heavy interest in campaign financing issues in the late 1990s and early 2000s.
Right on. And so since then, I guess the other big kind of campaign finance thing was the whole allowance of uncapped kind of corporate money and, you know, the discussion of, I remember when Yang ran for president, he was advocating this idea of every citizen would have a, few $100 that they could donate to whoever they wanted to try and level the playing field. Do you remember, did you hear about that proposal? I think he called it democracy dollars or something to try and wash out the big checks.
Yeah, no, it's a plan that's been discussed in lots of places, academically, politically. There's a similar plan, democracy vouchers in the city of Seattle, currently ongoing. It's been discussed in other places. And absolutely, it's a way to sort of maybe if we give average citizens a little bit of more investment in the campaign financing process, it will drown out all the big dollars that are spent by super PACs. If every American voter had $100 and they could spend it in an election, and you multiply that by 200 million Americans or 100 million voting Americans, it doesn't really matter if some big dollar donor comes along with $10 million. democracy dollars would swamp that. That's the general idea anyway. It would also push candidates to think more about what citizens want and not what big donors want.
Yeah. So what's the general sort of reaction to that type of idea from the kind of reigning two parties? Are they skeptical of that? Does one party want it? Do they both want it? Or
Well, I think there's probably more skepticism from Republicans, primarily because the argument would go is that that's a huge investment of taxpayer money into
Mhm.
campaigns. There would be some concern, I think, among Democrats of using taxpayer money to essentially fund Republican candidates, because many voters would use their dollars to give to Republicans and Republican
Right.
causes. But I think primarily the opposition would come from those who are worried about spending, and that would primarily be conservatives. My reaction to that is always that if you look at how much it is, even if it was $10 billion in taxpayer money used to fund our elections, I mean, that is not a massive investment
Yeah.
compared to how much we spent in Afghanistan over 20 years, for example. So I think there's some ways to balance out how we spend our money in order to enhance the electoral process. From an academic perspective, there's some concern about, would this do the things that, advocates say it will do? And that's probably why it's nice to have this play out in some cities, and maybe it would be adopted by a state and use those as the sort of laboratories to see what would happen.
Yeah. What is the biggest concern aside if you could figure out or accept the budget impact, which I agree with you, seems like it would be modest compared to all the other things that we spend trillions on. Um, what would be is the biggest concern? Oh, hey, you've got public money going to your opponents, but I would imagine if you're a Democrat and there are probably a lot more leaning Democrats than Republicans, that would generally be a net positive.
Yeah, it would be, except that, similar to trying to get people to vote, I think there would be some concern that there would be lots of people who wouldn't use this resource. And so
Ah,
it's hard to get people motivated who are traditionally unmotivated to participate in politics. I mean, for all the debate we had last year about ballot access, I mean,
mm-hmm.
and there is a lot of movement to try to prevent making voting easier. There was a long stretch of time where the goals, almost by consensus, were ways to make access to the ballot easier. We've seen some backlash on that lately.
Right.
But by and large, it isn't too hard to vote in this country, especially in places like, say, Maine, where you can register on election day.
Yeah.
Yet we still don't have 90% turnout. There are lots of people who just don't participate. And so I think with this, it would be free money. If you don't use it, you lose it. But many people wouldn't use it. So I think there would be some concern about how that would skew in terms of who would use it.
Right. So the risk to the Democratic Party would be like you'd get these hardcore, super energized Republican voters. Let's say what we saw certainly with the people that would go to like the Trump rallies and stuff, and they would go to the trouble of using the full extent of their democracy vouchers, and then you'd have a lot of semi kind of involved Democratic voters who, if you ask them, they would prefer the Democratic Party, but they're not going to go out of their way to do the paperwork to do
Yeah.
these democracy vouchers. Yeah,
I think that would be a legitimate hypothesis of what could play out.
yeah.
But it's nonetheless, we've got some evidence from Seattle in how it's working, and marginally, it seems to have diversified the donor pool, and that alone is probably one good reason to see how this plays out in some places over the course of the next couple of cycles. And
Yeah. Why do you think the political engagement is so modest? It seems like you've got, like in Virginia, when there was this very kind of energizing issue of, oh, McAuliffe is not going to let you decide or have impact on what your kids are taught. That was like a very strong lightning rod for the Republican turnout, and the McAuliffe argument of, hey, my opponent is like Trump, it just didn't seem to resonate as much. I don't think Trump really showed up in the campaign trail. he, still doesn't have his Twitter account back. So, do you like? Aren't we? It seems like we're on a path where, in order to win, you've got to come up with these really divisive, emotional topics, and that's how you drive turnout. Has that always been the case? It didn't feel like it was that extreme in the past.
Well, we have become far more emotionally polarized. So, this our politics today is so much more about identity politics, which is then tied to culture war debates that,
Mhm.
the vitriolic identity based engagement with politics is so much more a part of how we function now than it was 20 years ago. And that was the beginning, or at least we were starting to see polarization really take root in the 1990s with Republicans finally winning control of Congress and going up against Bill Clinton. And that sort of then started this ball rolling here of sort of intense identity based politics that has continued. And so, yeah, I think that's one of the challenges. I mean, the Democrats have this debate all the time about whether they should, embrace progressive issues and invest in an identity-based sort of diverse coalition and speak to those diverse audiences versus running a sort of more centrist campaign on popular issues that will appeal to rural white voters. And
Mhm.
they just keep having that debate a little bit. And Republicans, meanwhile, have done fairly well at mobilizing the white vote and doing that with identity-based appeals and cultural wedge issues. And so,
Yeah.
without Trump giving moderate conservatives some antipathy, I really would prefer the Republicans, but I can't stand Trump, so I'll vote
Mhm.
for someone who's like like Biden. Without that sort of way of peeling off some of those moderate conservative voters, these, they seem like sensible issues. Gee, of course I want parents involved in my kids' education. I want to be involved in my kids' education. So of course
Mhm.
that seems so sensible, but Trump always makes, jumbles that sensibility. And so without him around, I think Republicans can continue to take this approach, and Democrats will continue to battle over what is the best counter to that.
Yeah, it's so interesting in that I guess for the November 2020 election, because you had such a strong polarizing figure in Trump, you were able to activate these moderates. And once Trump sort of, I guess good or bad, lost his Twitter account and his mouthpiece, he no longer was there to motivate these moderate voters.
Right.
And then, but then, you've got the kind of cultural issues that the kind of current Republican Party are pushing. That's interesting. So what are you, I know you probably don't make predictions for a living, but what do you think is going to happen in the midterms?
Well, first, I'm terrible at predictions, and I'm not a very good political strategist for that matter. So
Yeah.
I like data and I like analyzing it. I'm usually really good after elections, but I do know, based on our study, studies of political system, political ups and downs, that the Democrats are in big trouble for next year. And that's not just because of what happened on Tuesday. If McAuliffe had eked out a victory, it's still the case that the incumbent party, presidential party, loses seats in midterm elections. That's the history. And the Democrats have the slimmest majority you could probably imagine. And
Mm.
so, just a little bit of history working as it normally does, and they're going to lose control of the House and the Senate. Now, of course, a year away is a year away, and we're in a weird environment of, coming off of, or hopefully coming out of, or moving towards the end of COVID-19 and the public health issues that we've had. I imagine in a year from now, we'll be in a lot better place, and maybe that will play well for the president. But even if the president were to lose just 5 or 6 seats in the House, he would lose control of the House. So he doesn't really have much to give, and I think that suggests that he's going to be coming out of 2022 and into the beginning of the next presidential campaign looking kind of weak. And but again, don't put that as a prediction, because who knows? But that's what history would suggest is likely to be the situation in a year.
Wow, that's going to be a tough one, I guess. if they lose control of the Senate, and then 2024 rolls around, now you have a Republican-controlled Senate, and they perhaps kind of stuck Biden because he can't really get. I mean, he's having trouble getting things through already. I wonder what that means for the 24 presidential then, because it's not like Harris is going to have this winning thing to say, hey, let's just keep going. Maybe that will become an opening for some newer ideas. I don't know.
Well,
But,
yeah, of course, there's the other side of, what happens with Trump. So, Trump wasn't involved in the 2021 races. And as you suggest, as Republicans benefited from that. But by and large, he's still extremely popular with Republican voters. And if he wanted the nomination, I suspect he could pretty easily get it. And so, if he were running against Biden in 2024, maybe the same dynamics of 2020 would be playing out. And Biden could run against the guy that the Democrats have done pretty well running against in 2018 and 2020. And so, they might be in a position where, hey, I mean, just give Biden this another term. If you want to keep Republicans in Congress, that's fine. And maybe Biden could win another close election. But if the Republicans don't nominate Trump or he decides not to run, they have, given what just happened in Virginia, hope to suggest that a palatable candidate that says the same things could be very successful. So, but of course, all that's an eternity away. But that seems to be what Republicans or what Democrats are going to have to be thinking seriously about.
Interesting. So, in a strange way, some Republicans might be praying that Trump doesn't run. Because he's the only way that Democrats would win the White House, potentially.
I mean, I would say that I would guess that privately many Republicans would think that because suburban voters were key to Democrats' wins in 2018 and 2020, and they'll likely be important. They'll be very important again. I think Democrats have shown that they can win elections if they win a decent chunk of college-educated suburban voters. And if they just do the best they can with non-college educated rural voters, they can win those elections, even if it's close. But if you have a likable candidate who is still very conservative, but runs against the ineptitude of the Biden administration, then that suburban vote is going to be a lot closer. And obviously, they're still going to win rural white voters. And so it's going to be harder for Democrats to win that race. But but smarter people than me are thinking about all those things. So we'll see what happens.
I mean, it's a reminder for everybody. I just looked it up. I mean, Biden picked up Virginia in the 2020 presidential by almost 10 points.
Right.
Just about 10 points, 54-44. And then you got McAuliffe and Youngkin running against each other. Just, almost feels like moments later. The only difference is that Trump was silenced. I don't think he showed up. And if anything, Youngkin said, I don't want to talk about Trump. I want to talk about the future.
Right.
And then the Republicans win. So, who knows? Maybe Trump is probably I mean, I'm biased. I'm a big critic of his. But maybe he's the biggest reason why the Republicans could be in trouble in 24. Who knows?
That's true. There's also the other thing, and I haven't looked at the numbers in Virginia from last week, but the turnout obviously is going to be different in an off-year gubernatorial the presidential election. But the wrinkle to that is that turnout is seemingly always supposed to benefit Democrats. Turnout was astronomically high in 2020, and Trump almost won. So Republicans obviously especially with Trump, can get mobilized to vote when he's there to mobilize them. So I guess one wrinkle to what I said before is if you had a sort of fairly boring Republican candidate, a nice candidate, that didn't necessarily ruffle too many feathers, but was sort of boring, maybe it wouldn't motivate in this, some of the base the same way that Trump does. So that's the sort of other side of the coin. But certainly in 2020, the high turnout didn't necessarily hurt Republicans as much as you thought it, it suggested it might.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great point. I mean, I guess the Youngkin formula was he was kind of boring himself, but he had an exciting issue, which was, hey, those radical Democrats are going to teach your kids all these kind of radical ideas, and I'm going to protect your children. That combo of kind of like safe candidate, but very divisive, emotionally charged social issue. I mean, that's kind of cultural issue. Seemed like it worked. I mean, it kind of flipped a 10-point advantage in Virginia, at least in one election. Yeah.
Yeah, the other thing I'll say to that too is that, increasingly, in my area of study, which is campaign advertising, as campaign ads move more to a digital environment,
Mm-hmm.
campaigns are going to have more of an ability to sort of be boring to the people who like boring, right? I want to, balance the budget, and I want to, cut taxes and put more money in your pocket, to mainstream sort of moderate voters. And you put that on TV, and then you target your Facebook ads and your Google ads to the people that want to hear about critical race theory and defund the police. And so you're not necessarily saying different things. You're just, well, you are, but you're not contradicting yourself. You're just emphasizing different messages to different constituencies.
Yeah.
We've always worried about that, but one of the reasons that it's never been a huge problem is because typically campaigns were broadcast at the fairs. You had radio,
Right.
TV ads, media was watching those things. And so, but now things are far more under the radar in terms of the media outreach that campaigns can do with digital messages. So I think you might see that boring candidate be pretty incendiary to the people that respond to those messages.
Yeah. So then that candidate can basically run multiple campaigns, uh, throwing fire on whatever top issue for each group gets them most animated and gets them to show up.
Possibly.
Yeah. Well, Michael, let's talk. We're going to take a quick break to thank some of the sponsors of this channel. And then I'd love to talk about your research on advertising more, and just get an understanding of like what you see the future looking like. We've already touched on the kind of micro targeting. I'm curious about, is there a point of diminishing returns? Because I remember when Bloomberg ran in the primaries, I mean, he had a lot of advertising going on, and it didn't seem to kind of move the numbers for him. But let's hit that in 1 second. In the first, let me thank some of the supporters of this channel. Let me just pull up their names. Okay, so we're going to start with our highest level supporter, who is the Senior VP of Nerds for Humanity, Soldier One. Thank you, Soldier One. And then we're going to go to the VP level. Kristen Slevin, Laura Lane, and Bike. Thank you very much. And then we're going to go to the hardcore level. We've got Mike, Gene, David, DK, Jackalego, Kirsch, Mr. History, Byron, Mona, Susan, Yang, Tony, Robert, Dean, Statner, Galessa, J. Perrin, AH, J. Brian, Vivian, Dana, Yoda, Jason, and Parth. And then we'll quickly scroll through the verified nerds, who you can see on the screen now. Thank you, all you verified nerds, for supporting the channel, making sure we can pay for our hosting costs and allow us to have more conversations like this. You guys are awesome. And so with that, we'll come back to our conversation, Michael, about political advertising. On the one hand, you can't help but be concerned about all of this money that gets spent in these campaigns. On the other hand, it was kind of encouraging to see Bloomberg not be able to kind of move voters as much, at least in the primary, despite massive kind of spending. And there were some other primary candidates who were spending tons of money early on that didn't really get that much traction. What's your take on the effectiveness of political advertising?
Well, I mean, that's absolutely right. I mean, Bloomberg spent more money probably in a month running for president than some candidates had spent running for president for a year, and even 2 years. And so he put more TV ads up on TV than it was a record breaking. And so And so on the one hand, absolutely, a campaign, you can't buy an election with TV ads just by blanketing the airwaves with TV ads. You have to be a good candidate, and you have to have a good message. And so in some sense, voters are discerning about what they listen to. They come to campaigns with their partisanship as an anchor, with their prior opinions and ideological beliefs as their anchor. It's hard to convince people to totally change their mind. And certainly the media narrative around Bloomberg was he was going to come in and if not try to buy the election, certainly dwarf and swamp everything else. And so our research has tended to suggest that given all of that, given that people come to politics with a lot of predispositions, campaign ads are effective but marginally effective. Their effectiveness is fairly small, and it's larger in elections like primaries, especially in places where the candidates are generally less well known. But you only get a small percentage of the vote if you out advertise your opponent. And so to that extent, they matter most in close elections where you have the ability to out advertise your opponent. And that's hard to do. And so you don't want to be out advertised by your opponent. So that's why you go toe to toe with them and you try to stay. And that's why there's more money. It's almost an arms race.
Yeah.
The aggregate effect of those ads is not all that much, in the grand scheme.
Right.
And so it's sort of an, in many ways, a strange outcome. There's so much money invested in this thing that doesn't matter that much. But if we're in a universe where you didn't advertise and your opponent out advertised you by a lot, then they'd have a much better chance of winning because they'd get that marginal effect.
Right. So in this case, this is from 538. They were looking at TV ad spending in the primaries. And you see this brown or tannish thing, which is Bloomberg. And he outspent his opponents by a tremendous amount. But if you're if you're in the back of the pack and you spend that amount of money, that might move you up a spot or two, but it doesn't like catapult you to the top position. Now, if Sanders had spent that kind of money, it might have changed the outcome, I would imagine, right? Because he was already kind of number 2-ish. Right.
Yeah. So like in a race where you're talking like this is primaries. And so in a primary election where, we're controlling for partisanship, everybody voting here is mostly Democrats or people who are disposed to the Democrats. So there the advertising might have more of an impact. And someone like Sanders, who's more, well known as at least ran in 2016, ran in 2020, had a good base of support. If he was able to blanket the airways with those amount of ads, may have been able to pick up some support in some of those early states and lasted a little bit longer. But I think there was still baked into the Democratic electorate some skepticism about Sanders' ability to win the general election. And there was and that got activated when Biden won the South Carolina primary and basically convinced Democrats that he could potentially win this thing. He wasn't a perennial loser in these early contests. And then those sort of desire to beat Trump almost outweighed everything else was happening in the campaign. And so the ads can mix that up, but it can't change those sort of fundamental senses that people have. And then the other thing is that there's media coverage happening alongside it. So like Bloomberg was trending pretty well in some of the polls in those Super Tuesday states until he had a really bad debate. Then the media coverage kind of descended on him and everything fell apart. So, part of me, as a nerd myself, would love to have a time machine and go back in time and then tell Bloomberg to stay off the stage and then run that election and see what happens with Bloomberg just being the sort of TV ad candidate, see if he can win a couple of those states and then stick around a little bit longer. But at the end of the day, I don't think Democrats were really in love with Mike Bloomberg. And so that limits the effectiveness of those ads.
Yeah, I mean, it does underscore the potential value of a debate appearance. Then that could have been worth hundreds of millions of dollars in ads just to be on the stage and then have a good performance. That was a hot topic within the Yang gang in the primaries because, Yang, when he was on the stage, he wasn't getting a lot of airtime. He wasn't getting a lot of questions. And then, of course, as the kind of bar for inclusion in the debates kept being raised, it became this kind of vicious circle. It's like, well, if you're not going to give us
Yes.
time in the debates, we can't improve our polling numbers. If we can't improve our polling numbers, you're not going to invite us to the next one. Do you have you ever thought about valuing like airtime in a debate? I mean, because there's probably like an equivalent economic value to it for
Right.
a campaign, right?
Definitely. I mean,
Yeah.
you could try to figure out a way to test that, effectively. Some of that you might do sort of experimentally by sort of showing people various sort of clips of debates and then seeing if the treatment, which might be a sort of 30-second clip versus a 2-minute clip of a sort of candidate in the middle of the pack, has more value than than the same difference for a candidate who might be ahead or a candidate who's sort of way in the back. It's hard to test with observational data because you could look at the change in poll numbers before and after debates with different face time or different talking times for each candidate, but it's hard to know if that's the primary cause because campaigns are also advertising and campaigning at the same time. So it would be hard to put a dollar value on that, but there's no doubt that that would be an interesting question to try to figure out, and you see the networks will do this, they'll have little tickers, or at least the people who are trying to judge it afterwards will say, this person talked for 30 seconds, this person talked for 2.5 minutes, and we'll rank those. And in a primary environment like that, where there's 16, 18 candidates, who are trying to vie for the nomination, it's really hard to figure out sort of how to stand out.
Yeah. It definitely brings out, in some ways, the worst in the candidates because they kind of keep talking over each other. But if they try and play nice, then they kind of fade to the background. But then if they keep jumping in, they look a little bit too pushy.
Absolutely, you got to score that land, and that's what hurt Kamala at the beginning too, trying to go after Biden on busing. Didn't work, and so, but you only have that one opportunity, so you try to find something that might actually make news, and that's what's so wacky about these debates. And so, I don't have a good solution to that, but that's what makes it really hard in that kind of wide environment.
So, Michael, tell me about the research you're doing with Wesleyan. Like, are there any interesting trends you're seeing, or kind of perspectives that are revealing themselves as you're looking at all this data that you want to share?
Well, I think there's primarily two things that we're deeply fascinated in. One, which we've been tracking for a long time, and that's outside group investment in elections. It's my dissertation, as I mentioned, but also after the Citizens United decision by the court in 2010, the role of these outside groups in advertising and funding elections has been huge, especially in competitive House and Senate races. And we've been tracking that for a long time and watching that play out and trying to measure the impact of that. And we've been looking at the various ways that outside groups get involved. Some are super PACs that do make their donors public, and some are what we call 501c4 nonprofit groups that we otherwise talk about as dark money groups that accept big contributions and then don't reveal who their donor base is. And we're really interested in the sort of ways in which they impact the dynamics of an election. And so they can get involved in a campaign and they can change the agenda, or they can influence the agenda and really move the debate in a campaign towards the area that those groups want, and away perhaps from the way the candidates would like to debate. So the impact of those groups in the sort of dynamics of elections is really important to us. The second thing, which is really a huge growth area that I mentioned before, was on digital advertising. And this is using the Facebook and Google ad libraries, which were launched in 2018, to get a good handle on how much money is being spent in the digital space to influence elections. And so we're interested in the kinds of micro-targeting I talked about, but also what types of groups are investing in digital advertising that's different from the types of groups that are advertising on television. Are they the same? Are they different? Are they saying things that are different from candidates, and so forth? And so these are all interesting questions that we're asking. We don't have great answers on them because we're still trying to handle all that data. There's a ton of data out there. And so that's our primary, I think, one of our primary main focuses right now.
Yeah, I was just looking at this post by the Wesleyan Media Project, looking at percent of ads aired by outside groups versus by the parties themselves. And the thick black line is the outside groups.
Yep.
And I mean, it by definition, those outside groups cannot coordinate with the campaign, right? They have to just do
That's
their own
right.
thing.
That's right. But many times those groups are being funded or run by close associates of those candidates. So,
Right.
so it's not always the case, but
Right.
sometimes, your college roommate might be running a super PAC to advocate for you in a close election. And although you can't talk to your college roommate and tell them what to do, you're certainly happy to have your friend running that super PAC rather than someone you've never met or known before. And candidates also signal what they want. They might have a press conference that says, it's really important to us that we win, in northern Maine, and we don't have the resources right now to advertise in northern Maine. That would really help. It's what we need to do to win. Of course, that's sending a very public, non-coordinated signal to your best man that that super PAC should go upstate. So those are the kinds of things that are I think concerning in our research. So,
do you ever see the opposite happen where these outside groups are they kind of, the candidates wish the outside groups would not participate because they're kind of dragging the conversation in a direction that the candidate themselves may not want? Or is it generally like this kind of wink wink, hey, I'm going to do a press conference, like you'll see what I want you to say thing?
We see both. Certainly, some super PACs are what we call or what are referred to as candidate only or single candidate super PACs. So that's the instance where your buddy is running the super PAC, and so that you might see a tight link there. But other times you might have traditional groups like gun rights groups or environmental groups who decide that you being elected is better than the opponent, and they come in and they talk about the things they want to talk about. But they might talk about it in ways that you don't want to talk about. You don't want to talk about cap and trade. You don't want to talk about a carbon tax. You don't want to talk about, guns. You don't want to talk about any of that stuff. But these groups, they're invested in those issues, and they come in, and that's what they want to tell voters about because that's what they think is the most important thing. So we do see both instances of that. We never really know what candidates want, but certainly we see instances where the candidate is never talking about an issue and a group comes in and talks only about that issue. And obviously, that says something about the priorities of the candidate.
So tell me a little bit about these outside groups. Like I've seen those ads and it's like paid for by Americans for Progress or, whatever. And you wonder like who's writing the check for these things? Is that easily accessible? And why wouldn't they be required to like indicate the top actual donors, so like, oh, this is some ad kind of criticizing Green New Deal, but it might be paid for by like Exxon or something like that. But you can't figure that out because it's just the Center for American Prosperity or something like that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I will say that this is a definite problem at the federal level because super PACs, which do register as super PACs, do have to make their donors publicly available, not in the ad themselves, but on the FEC's website, fec.gov. However, that does not prevent those super PACs from accepting money from groups that themselves don't have to disclose. So the situation might be where you're the Center for American Democracy super PAC, and parallel to that is the Center for American Democracy nonprofit. The Center for American Democracy nonprofit accepts all the money from the donors, and then that nonprofit gives the money to the super PACs, like a money laundering situation.
Right.
And then the Center for American Democracy super PAC says, oh, we're 100% transparent. We've made all of our donors available online, but it turns out the only donor is this nonprofit. So that problem is, that could be fixed with some campaign finance laws that insisted that nonprofit groups who advertise in elections must make those donors public.
Yeah.
Been a huge fight. Some states have gotten in front of this with state elections or, sort of state candidates and do require not only disclosure of that money, but also in the ad itself require that top funders of the group be listed in the ad itself. So in some states you might see that, top donors or so-and-so. Usually it's too fast to see and
Yeah.
Some changes to those laws too. But that does help. If you're, here in Maine, we just had a ballot measure about an energy corridor, an electric transmission lines that our Central Maine Power wanted to run throughout Maine, and they were primarily funding the ads, but they would put them through these groups called like Mainers for Fair Laws or Mainers for Local Power. It sounds really good. But if you required that the ad itself said that the main donor to that group was Central Maine Power, which in Maine nobody likes, then that would send a huge cue to voters that this group is not really Mainers as much as it is a front for the energy company. So that's, I think it's important to think about some changes to our laws that do insist on more transparency.
Yeah, that is such a hard one, because I guess when you said that there were some states or some areas where you have to list your top funders, is top funders like the individuals, or is it because if it's like an entity,
Right.
then you just have this shell game of like the little Russian dolls, like you don't really know who's behind
Absolutely.
it. Yeah.
That would be a problem, and that is a problem. So like in some states that can happen where their primary funder might be another group.
Right.
So you never primarily know. We can have, there's policymakers have this fight all the time about what the underlying, should we really try to find the underlying source of the donors?
Yeah.
And make that transparent. And that seems sensible. I don't know how far back you want that to go, right? Like, you could set up 3 or 4 layers here and funnel that money, but that'd be pretty sleazy. So I do think it's useful to think about some reforms that would require the ultimate source of the funds to be made more clear.
Yeah.
But there's no easy solution.
Now, I would imagine foreign entities, are they allowed to contribute to these outside groups, or are they barred from doing that?
They're not allowed, especially when those groups invest in federal candidate elections. They are not necessarily barred. They are allowed, in other words, to invest in ballot measures in some states, and that is an ongoing, I think, increasing question. And so, but in general, foreign companies and foreign nationals cannot spend money in American elections, whether through super PACs or with candidate-based contributions. But the slippage here a little bit is both in ballot measures, and then also without having transparency on these nonprofit groups, we don't necessarily know if they've been illegally accepting foreign money. So you might be the Center for American Democracy nonprofit, and you have a legal right to spend money in elections. You don't have a right to accept foreign investments, but you also don't have to prove or show who your donors are. So unless you're audited, there's no transparency. And if you do get audited, there's no doubt that group is going to claim that is a political witch hunt. So you have this problem here where without some more required transparency of your funding, nonprofit groups have the capacity to kind of play fast and loose with some of these rules.
Wow. I would not be surprised if that does happen, where like maybe the Center for American Success or whatever isn't even aware that they're getting this big check from the Group for American Innovation, which is then funded 3 layers up by like Volkswagen, and they're trying to push back on carbon tax or something like that.
Right. Or maybe the Russians. I would have sort of scoffed a bit in 2016 at the idea that the Russians would have spent any money trying to influence the 2016 election, and they didn't spend a tremendous amount of money, but they were obviously interested in messing with us, and so they did that with Facebook ads in 2016. And so now at the end of the day, I don't really think this is a huge concern. I don't really think this happens a lot, but I do think that it's not a problem until it is, until someone wins a very close election. That has huge impacts, and then it's discovered later on that they won that election maybe because of the investment of an outside group that was funded by a foreign investor. So that would really seriously threaten the integrity of that election. And so so I think there's something we talk about integrity. I think voter fraud isn't a huge issue think issues around campaign financing is. And so I think we could do some more to help with that. All that energy we're putting into preventing, making sure people have voter IDs, we should maybe be putting into making sure that our elections are as clean as possible.
Yeah, like a donor ID. We have a question from Gnomes Rex, who says, "Hey, if Andrew Yang were to create a PAC for his new party, the Forward Party, then it would make it difficult because they couldn't coordinate with each other. Is that a danger?" I mean, we touched a little bit on this. I guess the benefit of the PAC is that then you can raise unlimited funds. You're not capped by how much donors can give. And I think the slimy way this would happen is like if someone from Yang's old campaign team were tapped to run that PAC, then they can stay coordinated. It's like your best man example.
Right.
That's how it works, basically, right?
That would be how it would work. Now, I would say that, in many cases, that best man might not be, might be following the letter of the law by not coordinating with you behind the scenes, but might, there might be some shenanigans and there might be some sort of really getting close to those limits. But even parties can only coordinate with candidates up to a certain limit. And so political parties obviously can help candidates, but and they can provide them advice and so forth. But there is when it comes to spending money on behalf of that candidate, and this doesn't count for like training and for consultations and other things. But if they were going to air ads on behalf of the candidate, there is a limit on how much a party can coordinate with candidates, and that's to prevent essentially using the party as a pass around of other limits on candidates. So, so it's not as if not forming a party prevents you from having that coordination opportunity with a candidate. You can, but not as much as maybe people might think.
Yeah. One last thing I want to hit before we wrap up, Michael, is I don't know if you've been observing this movement or discussion around the benefit of having more open primaries. And I actually saw in the news, I think Maine is thinking about opening up primaries, and was just curious if you think that will have any impact on outcomes.
It's a great question. I would like to see, or at least do some more research on the history of this in open primary states. One of the issues that we have here in Maine is ranked choice voting. And with ranked choice voting, at least in state elections, the idea is that, if you don't like, you can rank your candidates, and it's supposed to make the candidate who appeals to the most voters more likely to win. And, whether that's worked out or not is still an open question, but the idea of open primaries is supposed to in many ways have that same impact, I think, right? So that you got to appeal to potential Republicans or independents who are now going to be in the mix. It'd be worth looking into some more. I'm a little suspicious that it will have major impacts, primarily, again, because turnout in primaries tends to be amongst the party faithful and not always amongst independents who don't have as much interest in the process. And so I'm not, super convinced of that, but I do think that I am, of course, becoming a little more jaded around how polarization is really mucking up the process here and preventing policy from being made. And so I'm open to considering any and all reforms that would either make it easier for people to vote. Independents in closed primary states are kind of blocked out, and trying to encourage some bipartisanship in various ways. So, that's something to consider. But I think an initial glance would be a little suspicious of its impacts, only because of who ends up voting in these elections.
Yeah, you're underscoring this point, which we talked about it earlier in the show, around it's all about turnout. And I guess the sad thing is the things that get people to turn out, things that make them angry and kind of demonize the other side, are precisely the types of kind of energy and divisiveness that make it impossible to get any actual reform done once these candidates win, because they rode in on a platform of division and extreme polarization.
Right.
Then, like, what do you expect when they get to Congress? They're not going to suddenly become these, pragmatic kind of bipartisan people of compromise.
That's right. I'm really interested in ways to enhance people's desire to participate in politics as a civic responsibility. I feel like we need to do more education of young people about their responsibility as citizens. I think we've gotten away from some of that. And I think it would be great if people voted on the basis of, even if they don't love the candidates that are running, they don't love the choices, ultimately, we get to make the decision about who represents us, or make the decision about which policy we want if we're voting in ballot measures. And we should, participate because that's our responsibility. And that might involve pushing us to actually try to change, a couple steps above who's running or how policy gets made. But at the base, participating and turning out should be something that we see as part of our citizenship. And I don't think it's seen by a lot of people who are so jaded or they're so dissatisfied. And I think we could do more to educate young people about that. And that may change things in the long run. And of course, I might just be a little too optimistic about that. But I think we need to do more to foster that sense of citizenship.
100% agree. I mean, it's ironic that the people who are not participating anymore, generally they'll say, well, it's just people screaming at each other. And I think what you're saying is, well, if you don't participate and you only let the tails of the distribution participate, then you're only encouraging more of that screaming match.
Right.
Because the candidates don't need to care about the reasonable middle, the center, because they just need to get the sort of most fired up people to vote for them, and that's how they're going to win. Now, if everybody participated, then the candidates would naturally need to have a much more inclusive platform. But right now, as less and less people participate, it's only going to make the situation worse.
That's right. And it might take a long time for us to get to sort of that point of maximum participation. We'd have to put up with we always have to put up with outcomes of elections that we don't like. But I do think that, more engagement from more citizens would change our system in ways that, we don't even really know, because it would put so much more emphasis on what the wider electorate really wants. And just think about all the energy that went into getting the turnout up in 2020, and probably one of the most important elections of most of our lives, given what was at stake and how divisive we are. And we got 2/3 of eligible voters turned out to vote. But even in 2020, 1/3 of eligible voters didn't think it was, important to vote. And of course, I'll add to that, some of those voters may have felt as if they were blocked out because of some of the attempts to make it harder to vote in some states. So it's not just total apathy, but there is a lot of apathy. And I think that we've got to change that somehow. And I think that's endemic to a broader problem we're having. It's not just citizens' fault. Obviously, people are responding with a lot of distrust of a lot of institutions and a lot of anger. Those are the kinds of things that we need to really grapple with. Not so much procedural changes or institutional tweaks, but maybe ways, and I'm a fan of those, but also ways to really reinvigorate people's sense of wanting to participate. And I think about this when I think about campaign ads. People always lament, there's so much money, and how many conversations I've had over the years where people are just so mad that there's so many ads. The alternative is what? The alternative is turning out to vote without knowing what you're voting on, or not turning out to vote because you don't care and you never heard of anybody. It's not optimal to have campaign ads as much as we've had, but they tell us what's at stake. They tell us who's running and what they want to accomplish, and they're asking for our vote. And that's a democracy. And so we may not like it. We may not like how messy and how negative it is and so forth, but that's a democracy. And so there's a lot to really celebrate about, campaigns trying to win us over, as much as we think that the dialogue should be different. There's still a lot of positives about living in a system where we get to decide who wins and loses and who runs the system.
100%. It reminds me, I spent a few years in Switzerland, and I was always impressed how they, as a direct democracy, they had, the equivalent of elections where they had to vote on legislation and things, um, a few times a year. And they would send out these thick primers where, each side had a fixed number of pages to describe, why they were advocating for the position. I was always impressed at how, so many of the citizenry were actively engaged and reading through. Yeah, I
Mm.
remember asking my barber, about what was sort of next on the docket, and they're like, "Oh, we're right now have to vote on specifically should we spend a certain amount of money on the Joint Strike Fighter." And she knew, um, the budget and the cost per plane and the maintenance costs, and she was like, "Yeah, I don't think this makes sense. I'm not going to vote for it." And I was like, "Wow, you probably know more about each line item in the Swiss budget than many of us do on sort of even like how much we spend on Medicare." But that's like part of their culture.
Right.
They were born, they were raised with this notion that this is our government. We are accountable. And she was always so surprised, like, why do you put so much trust in these single individuals?
Right.
Like, it's like a king almost, like, but that's not a perfect system either. It's a small country, obviously. Maybe you can do that
That's
in a
right.
smaller
And
country.
I'm not so much of a Pollyanna to think that just more people voting is going to solve things. There's obviously endemic and institutional challenges and impediments and barriers for people to participate and to get the knowledge that they need to be good and active citizens, and that there's institutional forms of prejudice and so forth. So I understand those things, of course,
Hmm.
and I know that those are huge barriers for people, and I want to change those things. Uh, uh, but I'm also a strong advocate for a vigorous democratic system where people participate and establish and stake out what they want in terms of policymakers. And so I think there's a lot we could do to enhance our democratic system. And I always encourage people to vote as a way to start that process.
Well, Michael, thank you so much for spending a little bit of your Sunday afternoon with us. Are you in Hubbard Hall, by the way, or where are you at?
I am, in fact. I am.
Oh man.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So it's such a great school and beautiful building as well. So appreciate you coming in on a Sunday afternoon and chatting with the nerds. And if you're watching this live, please like and share. If you're seeing it on replay, do the same. Comment below. Let us know what you think. And Michael, I hope we can get you back on the show in the future. It's been a really great conversation.
Would love it. Anytime.
All right. With that, we'll say goodbye, nerds.
Goodbye, nerds.